The brutal accident stole my voice and body, but not my mind. Lying motionless in that hospital bed, I had to listen to my own wife whisper, "Cancel his rehab. That money's wasted on a man who can't even wipe his own face." The biological son I raised with all my heart coldly calculated, "The house is mine anyway." They thought I was a helpless vegetable, but the second they walked out, I opened my eyes and painfully signed to my private nurse, "Call my lawyer." Thank you so much for being here with Dad's Revenge Stories. Before you go, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? Please keep in mind, certain artistic adaptations are woven into this presentation for storytelling and conceptual impact. Any similarity to living persons or existing places is purely coincidental, yet the underlying message carries practical worth. The accident took my voice, not my mind. I need you to understand that from the beginning, because everything that comes after every decision, every silence, every carefully placed tear depends on you knowing that one truth. When the truck ran the red light on Junction Boulevard and turned my pickup into a crumpled shell of metal, it stole the use of my hands, my legs, my throat. It left me lying in a hospital bed at Queen's Medical Center, staring at a ceiling I could not turn away from, breathing air I could not ask for more of. But my ears still worked, and my mind never stopped. My name is Walter Reed. I am 64 years old. For 40 years, I pulled wire, climbed into attics in August, heat crawled under houses in January frost, and built Reed Electric from a second-hand van and a toolbox into a company that employs 31 people in Queens. My father loaded cargo at JFK Airport for 30 years and never once complained. My mother cleaned offices in Midtown 5 days a week and still had dinner on the table by 6. I learned everything worth knowing from watching those two people refuse to quit. I tell you this because I want you to understand what kind of man was lying in that hospital bed. Not a soft man. Not a man who frightened easily. Not a man who had ever once in his life waited for someone else to solve his problems. But on the morning of day 4, I could not move a single finger. Dr. Brooks came in early before Sandra arrived. He was a careful man, the kind who chose his words the way a carpenter chooses wood, deliberately, with an eye toward what would hold weight. He stood beside my bed and spoke in that measured tone doctors use when they are delivering news they cannot fully explain. "Mr. Reed," he said, "the swelling in your brain has decreased significantly overnight. Based on our assessments, we believe you have a much higher level of awareness than initially indicated." He paused, letting that settle. "You may be understanding more of what happens around you than people realize. That's actually an encouraging sign." He wrote something on his clipboard, nodded once, and walked toward the door. I heard Sandra's voice in the hallway before I heard her footsteps. She was thanking him. Her voice was warm, slightly breathless, the voice of a woman carrying an almost unbearable weight with tremendous grace. I had heard that voice at fundraising dinners, at neighborhood association meetings, at my company Christmas parties. Sandra had always known exactly how to sound in a room. "We're all just praying for a miracle," she told Dr. Brooks. "Keep hoping," he said. "Sometimes patients surprise us." The door opened. Her perfume reached me before she did something expensive, something she had bought with the joint credit card 3 months ago. I remembered the statement. I remembered thinking it was a lot for perfume. I had not said anything because I had not wanted an argument. I wished I had said something. Sandra stood beside my bed. She smoothed the blanket over my legs with both hands, a gesture so practiced it looked like love. Then she turned her head slightly toward the door to confirm it was closed. The warmth drained from her face the way water drains from a bathtub, completely, and faster than you would expect. Derek stepped out from the corner of the room. My son. 32 years old. He had his mother Diana's jaw and my father's broad shoulders, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, I felt the particular ache of seeing Diana in his face. That ache had never fully gone away in 12 years. I did not expect it ever would. Derek looked at me the way you look at a car that has broken down on the highway, assessing, calculating the cost of repair against the cost of replacement. He understands, Derek repeated flatly. So what? Sandra picked up her handbag from the chair and set it on the windowsill. So we need to be more careful about what we say in here. He can't do anything about it. Derek moved closer to the bed, and I felt every muscle in my body strain toward a reaction I could not produce. Look at him, Mom. He can't even blink on his own schedule. Cancel his rehab. That money's wasted on a man who can't even wipe his own face. The words hit me somewhere behind my sternum, not like a punch, but like a nail driven slowly with a heavy hammer. Wipe his own face. I had wiped my face with these hands for 64 years. I had wiped sweat from my face on a rooftop in July. I had wiped sawdust from my face in a basement in February. I had wiped tears from my face the morning Diana died, standing in a hospital hallway, not unlike this one, and told myself that I would be strong enough for our boy. Our boy was now standing over me and calling me a waste of money. Sandra glanced at the monitoring equipment beside my bed, the heart rate display, the oxygen sensor, as though checking whether my body had registered the insult. Then she straightened her jacket. We'll discuss it tonight, she said. Not here. Derek shoved his hands into his pockets. He walked to the window and looked out at the Queen's skyline, the water towers, the brick apartment buildings, the elevated train line I had ridden to my first job at 19 years old. He studied it all with the casual interest of someone surveying property they were about to inherit. Once everything settled, he said, his voice dropping just low enough that anyone passing in the hallway would hear nothing. The house is mine anyway. I've already looked at what it would take to renovate the basement, turn it into a proper apartment, rental income on top of everything else. Sandra made a small sound of agreement. Derek turned from the window and looked directly at me. I held his gaze, or rather I let my gaze hold his, since I could not turn away. For a moment something crossed his face. Not guilt. Something closer to discomfort, the way a person feels when a painting seems to watch them. He looked away first. He was useful once, Derek said quietly, more to himself than to Sandra. Now he's just in the way. Sandra picked up her handbag. I'll be back this evening. Keep your phone on. She walked out without touching me, without looking back. The door swung shut behind her with a soft, definitive click. The room went quiet. Somewhere outside my window, the elevated train rumbled past on its usual schedule, shaking the glass in its frame the way it had shaken windows in this neighborhood for 100 years. 40 years ago, I had ridden that train to a job site in Astoria with $15 in my pocket, and a determination so solid I could have built a wall with it. I thought about Diana. I thought about the morning she was diagnosed, how she had reached across the kitchen table and taken my hand and said, "We'll figure it out, Walt. We always do." I thought about what she would say if she could see this room right now, this bed, this ceiling. She would tell me to stop staring at the ceiling and start thinking. So I did. I closed my eyes, the one voluntary movement I had left, and I began to think. I catalogued everything I had just heard, every word, every pause, every calculation hiding behind Derek's flat voice and Sandra's careful warmth. I filed it away with the same precision I had always used to estimate a job, no detail too small, no number rounded up when an exact figure was available. And then I heard something different, soft footsteps, not Sandra's heels, not Derek's heavy tread, something lighter, more deliberate, the footsteps of someone who had learned to move quietly around people who were hurting. The door opened. I concentrated every remaining ounce of will into my eyelids and forced them open. A woman I had not seen before stood just inside the doorway, a clipboard in one hand and a calm expression that had clearly been tested and not broken by difficult rooms. She looked at the monitors, first professional habit, and then she looked at me. And she stopped. Not because something was wrong with the equipment, because something in my face had told her something the equipment could not measure. She took one step closer. She did not bustle. That was the first thing I noticed. Every other person who had walked into this room over the past 4 days had brought their own noise with them. The doctors with their clipboards and their careful sentences, the nurses with their cheerful efficiency, Sandra with her perfume and her performance. They filled the room the moment they entered it, the way people fill silence with talking because silence makes them uncomfortable. This woman was different. She moved to the monitors first, checking each reading with the focused attention of someone who actually intended to use the information. Her scrubs were plain navy blue. Her name badge read Patricia Okafor, RN. She looked to be in her mid-30s with close-cropped hair and the kind of steady hands that come from years of doing difficult things without flinching. She had not looked at me yet. Not really. Not the way I needed someone to look. I gathered everything I had left, which was not much. I want to be honest about that, and I pushed it all into my eyelids. The effort sent a white spike of pain through the back of my skull. My body had become a locked room, and I was standing on the wrong side of the door, throwing myself against it with everything I had. The door opened. My eyes came fully open. Not a flutter, not a twitch. Open, focused, directed at Patricia Okafor like a flashlight beam pointed straight at her face. She turned from the monitor. For 1 full second, she went absolutely still. Then she set her clipboard down on the bedside table deliberately, without looking away from me, and she took one slow step closer. Her eyes moved across my face the way an experienced reader moves across a page, picking up meaning between the lines. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly. Not a greeting, a question. I held her gaze with everything I had. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was surprised the monitor did not spike. 40 years of working job sites had taught me how to read a person in the first 30 seconds, whether they were the kind of person who showed up when things got hard or the kind who found a reason to be somewhere else. Patricia Okafor, in the space of 1 minute, had already shown me more genuine attention than anyone in this room had shown me in 4 days. She pulled the visitor's chair from the corner of the room and placed it directly beside my bed. Then she sat down, leaned forward with her elbows on her knees, and brought her eyes level with mine. "Can you understand what I'm saying to you?" she asked. "Blink once for yes." I blinked once. The breath she released was long and slow, the breath of a person who has just confirmed something they were afraid to hope for. Her eyes filled, not spilling over, just filling the way a glass fills when someone is being careful not to waste a drop. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady, even though her hands now gripping the bed rail were not. "Okay, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me. Can you do that?" One blink. "Do you want the people who have been visiting you to know that you understand them?" I blinked once, then immediately blinked again, twice. "No." She read it correctly without hesitation. "You don't want them to know." It was not a question. She nodded slowly, and something shifted in her expression, a door closing on one set of assumptions and opening on another. "All right, then they won't hear it from me." She held my gaze for another moment, making sure I understood that this was not a casual statement. She meant it the way people mean things when they have thought carefully about the consequences. I had not cried since the accident. My body had lost the ability to produce tears along with everything else. But something in my chest cracked open, the way old wood cracks not a clean break, but a splintering along a long-established fault line. Someone was asking me what I wanted. Someone was sitting in that chair and treating me like a man with intentions instead of a body with complications. Diana had done that. Diana had always done that. She used to say that the most important thing one person could do for another was to take their thinking seriously. I had not known how rare that was until I lost her. I thought about my sister Margaret, deaf from birth, fiercely alive in every other possible way. Our parents had learned American Sign Language alongside her, all of us stumbling through it together around the kitchen table in our apartment in Woodside. I was 9 years old the first time I signed a complete sentence to her across a crowded room at a family party, and the look on her face, the shock, and then the pure, uncomplicated joy of being understood had never left me. Margaret had been gone for 11 years. But the language we built together was still somewhere in my hands, buried under the damage, waiting. I focused on my right hand. The fingers were curled loosely against the mattress, unresponsive, as far as Sandra or any casual observer would be able to tell. I pushed my attention down through my shoulder, through my elbow, through my wrist, the way you trace a wire back to its source when a circuit fails. My index finger moved. It was less than a centimeter. It felt like dragging a refrigerator across a concrete floor, using only my thoughts. Pain flared up the length of my forearm, and I nearly lost the effort entirely. But the finger moved, and Patricia Okafor saw it. She leaned in closer. Her voice dropped to just above a whisper. "Try that again." I tried again. The finger lifted, bent slightly at the first knuckle, and came to rest in a position that was not quite a letter, but was clearly intentional. Pat's eyes went wide. She looked at my hand, then at my face, then back at my hand. Her lips parted. "Are you—" She stopped herself, looked again. 40 years ago, I had made that same shape with my fingers, reaching across a noisy kitchen table toward my little sister. Pat's next words came out barely above a breath. "Are you signing? Are you signing?" The question hung in the air between us like a live wire, charged, dangerous, full of potential in both directions. Pat was leaning so close I could see the small gold cross at her collarbone. Her eyes moved between my face and my hand, with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a problem they had not expected to encounter on a Tuesday afternoon in Queens. Her breath was shallow. Her fingers had tightened around the bed rail until her knuckles had gone pale. I blinked twice. "Yes." She exhaled hard through her nose, not relief exactly, more like a person who has just realized the ground beneath them is solid after all, and is still deciding whether to trust it. "How much do you remember?" she asked. "Of the signs? Blink once if it's enough to communicate." The honest answer was that I did not know. Margaret and I had built our shorthand over 20 years of Sunday dinners and crowded subway cars and family holidays, where neither of us wanted to talk to certain relatives out loud. I had not used ASL seriously in 11 years, not since the week of her funeral when I sat in her apartment in Flushing and went through her things alone because I could not bear for anyone else to touch them. But muscle memory is a stubborn thing. It lives deeper than thought, deeper than grief. My fingers knew things my brain had filed away. I blinked once. Pat pressed her lips together and nodded. Then she reached into the pocket of her scrubs and produced a small notepad, the kind nurses use to track vitals during a shift, and set it on the mattress beside my right hand. "I'm going to watch your fingers," she said. "Go slow. I'll write down what I think I see, and you can blink to confirm. 2 blinks for wrong, 1 for right." She paused. "Can we try that?" 1 blink. She positioned herself so her body blocked the view from the door's narrow window. Anyone walking past in the hallway would see a nurse leaning over a patient, adjusting something near his hand. Nothing unusual, nothing worth a second look. I focused. The pain was extraordinary, sharp and deep and unrelenting, traveling from my wrist to my shoulder every time I attempted even the smallest movement. I thought about the winter I had rewired an entire apartment building in the Bronx, with a broken thumb taping the joint myself each morning because I could not afford to lose the contract. I thought about my father's hands at the end of a shift, cracked and swollen, and how he had still managed to help me with homework at the kitchen table every night. Pain was just information. I had been receiving information my whole life. I formed the first letter. Pat leaned in. B, one blink. The second letter cost me. I felt something pull in the tendons along the back of my hand, a bright white complaint that made my vision blur at the edges. I pushed through it. Oh, one blink. I rested for 30 seconds. Pat did not rush me. She sat quietly with her notepad and her pen, and I understood in that pause that she was the kind of person who knew how to wait without making you feel the weight of her waiting. Final letter. B again. One blink. Pat looked at the notepad. Then she looked at me. Her voice had gone very careful. Bob, she said. You want Bob. One blink. Then a second. Then a third, because one blink was not enough for what I was trying to say. Pat understood immediately. You're Bob, someone specific. She pulled out her phone. Is there a contact someone I should call? She held the screen toward me, but I could not see it from this angle, and we both realized it at the same moment. She thought for a second. Then, I'm going to call the main contact listed in your intake file, the one marked emergency before your wife. She said those last 3 words with a deliberateness that told me she had already formed certain conclusions about Sandra and was simply waiting for confirmation. Is that the right person? I blinked once, twice. Once again, yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes. She stood, and for a moment I felt the particular cold of being left, the irrational fear that she would walk out that door and the world would reassemble itself into something I had no tools to fight. But she did not leave. She took 3 steps toward the window, turned her back to the door, and dialed. The phone rang twice. Then the door opened. I heard the shuffle of sneakers on linoleum light, young, unhurried. Pat spun around, phone still to her ear, and I watched her body language shift from tense to carefully neutral in under a second. The young man who stepped into the room was 19 years old, broad-shouldered, wearing a Mets cap and a Queensboro Community College sweatshirt. He stopped when he saw Pat on the phone, then looked at me. Marcus Reed. My sister Margaret's boy. He had her same dark eyes and the same habit she had of going very still when he was absorbing something important. I had taught Marcus the basics of ASL when he was 6 years old, sitting at the same kitchen table where Margaret and I had learned it, because I believed that a language built to cross distances should not die with the person who first needed it. He looked at my face, then at my hand, then back at my face. His mouth opened. I blinked at him twice, sharp a signal we had used since he was a child. For pay attention, something is happening. Marcus pulled off his cap and pressed it against his chest. His voice cracked slightly on the first word. Uncle Walt. From Pat's phone, a voice answered. Older measured the voice of a man who had learned to keep his reactions off his face in courtrooms for 30 years. This is Bob Whitfield. Pat glanced at Marcus, then at me. Understanding moved across her face like light across water. She took a slow breath and stepped toward the hallway door, pulling it almost shut behind her. Her voice, when she spoke into the phone, was steady and quiet, and absolutely certain. "Mr. Whitfield, my name is Patricia Okafor. I'm the private care nurse assigned to Walter Reed at Queen's Medical Center." A pause. "Mr. Reed is awake, sir. He is fully aware, and he needs you here tonight." The line was silent for 3 full seconds. Marcus stood beside my bed, his cap still pressed to his chest, his eyes bright and glassy. He reached out and very carefully placed his hand over mine, not gripping, just resting there warm and solid. He signed with his other hand, small and close to his body, so no one in the hallway could see. "I've got you." 5 in the morning smells different from every other hour. I had known that for 40 years, the particular combination of floor wax and recycled air and the faint electrical hum of a building running on its overnight skeleton crew. I had shown up at job sites at 5 in the morning my entire working life, and I had always believed that the people who showed up before the sun did were the people you could actually count on. Bob Whitfield showed up at 4:58. I heard him before I saw him, not his footsteps, but the quality of the silence that preceded him. The hallway outside my room had developed a rhythm over 4 days, the squeak of the medication cart. At 2 a.m., the shift change voices at 6, the particular shuffle of the overnight aide who checked vitals at 3:30, and always hummed something under his breath. What I heard at 4:58 was a break in that rhythm. Deliberate movement. Someone who knew exactly where he was going and had no intention of explaining himself to anyone who asked. The door opened 6 inches. Pat's face appeared in the gap, scanning the room once. Then she pushed it fully open and stepped aside. Bob Whitfield walked in. He was 61 years old, built like a man who had played linebacker in college and then spent 30 years sitting behind a desk, without quite losing the shoulders. He was wearing a gray wool overcoat over a flannel shirt and dark trousers, no tie, no briefcase, nothing that would mark him as anything other than a worried friend visiting outside of hours. He had left the briefcase in his car. I knew him well enough to know that was intentional. He crossed the room in 4 strides and stood at my bedside, and for a moment he simply looked at me, not with the careful professional assessment Dr. Brooks used, not with Sandra's practiced sorrow, but with the raw, unguarded expression of a man confronting something he had spent the drive over trying to prepare himself for and had not succeeded. His jaw tightened, his eyes went bright. "Walt," he said. His voice was rough at the edges in a way I had never heard in 30 years of watching him argue in front of judges. "You stubborn son of a—" He stopped himself, pressed his lips together hard, looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds, then back at me. Okay, I'm here." Marcus stepped forward from the corner where he had been waiting and signed to me he's ready. I blinked twice in acknowledgement. Then I looked at Bob and began. It took nearly 40 minutes. Every letter was a negotiation between my intention and my body's refusal. And Marcus interpreted with the patience of someone who understood that speed was not the point, accuracy was. Pat stood near the door, monitoring the hallway through the narrow window, her shoulders carrying the particular tension of a person holding a perimeter. Bob pulled a small notepad from his shirt pocket and wrote in the cramped, precise handwriting I recognized from 30 years of contract margins and meeting notes. He did not react outwardly to anything I signed. Not when I told him about Sandra's words the morning Dr. Brooks had left the room. Not when I described Derek at the window talking about renovation plans. Not when I relayed the conversation about canceling my rehabilitation. He wrote it all down with the same measured attention he gave to everything, because Bob Whitfield had understood from his first year of practice that a lawyer who reacted emotionally in the room was a lawyer who lost cases. When I finished, he set his pen down. "Diana's trust," he said quietly. He was not asking, he was confirming the way you confirm a load-bearing wall before you start renovating around it. Everything goes through the trust. Your companies, the house in Queens, the investment properties. Sandra has no independent access to any of it. She never did. I blinked once. I set it up that way on purpose. He said more to himself than to me. 12 years ago, when you were still deep in grief, I wasn't sure you were tracking what we were doing. He almost smiled. You were tracking every word. You always were. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped. Here's the problem, Walt. And I need you to hear this clearly. His voice dropped. Derek has filed a petition for medical guardianship. Under New York state law, if a court determines that a patient lacks the capacity to make their own medical decisions, it can appoint a guardian with legal authority over their treatment, which in practice means authority over everything. Who treats you? Where you go when you leave this hospital? What happens to your care? He let that settle for a moment. If that petition succeeds, Derek controls your life. Sandra influences Derek. You understand what that means. I understood exactly what it meant. I had built a company for 40 years by understanding leverage where it existed, who held it, and what happened when someone applied it to the wrong joint in a structure. Bob read my expression. I've already drafted a counterpetition. It requests an independent neurological evaluation to establish your cognitive competence. Once we have that evaluation on record, the guardianship petition collapses. He glanced at Pat. I'll need Dr. Park's cooperation. Pat spoke from the door without turning around. You have it. She's known since day 5. Bob absorbed this without visible surprise, which told me he had already suspected it. He looked back at me. There's something else, he said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a single folded document, not from a briefcase, not from a file. He had carried it in his pocket, which meant he had been holding on to it since before he walked into the building. Ray Cross called me 3 weeks ago, before the accident. He said Sandra had been asking about your morning route to the Junction Boulevard site, specifically which intersections you passed through, specifically what time. The heart rate monitor beside my bed ticked upward by 6 beats. Bob watched the number rise. His face did not change. I didn't think much of it then, he said. I'm thinking a great deal about it now. From the hallway came the sound of the overnight aide's cart, the familiar squeak of the wheel that needed grease growing louder as it approached. Pat turned from the window. Someone's coming, she said. Bob stood immediately and moved to the far side of the room, positioning himself near the window, with his back to the door, a visitor standing at the glass, looking out at the dark Queens skyline. Nothing unusual, nothing worth stopping for. The cart rolled past without slowing. Bob waited 10 full seconds before turning back around. When he did something in his posture, had shifted the overcoat. The flannel shirt, the carefully ordinary presentation of a man who had driven across Queens before dawn to sit beside his oldest friend. He looked at me with an expression I had seen only once before, the morning Diana's oncologist had used the word terminal in a sentence about someone we both loved. Walt, he said quietly, I think we need to talk about hiring a private investigator. Sandra arrived at 9:17. I knew her footsteps by now, the way you know a sound that has been part of your life for 8 years. The particular rhythm of her heels on linoleum, confident and unhurried. The walk of a woman who had never once in her life questioned her right to enter a room. I had found that quality attractive when we met. I had stopped noticing it somewhere around year 3. Lying in this bed, I found it unbearable. She pushed the door open with 2 fingers and stepped inside carrying a paper bag from the diner on Jamaica Avenue, the one we used to go to on Sunday mornings, before Sunday mornings became something she preferred to spend elsewhere. The smell of coffee and eggs reached me before she did, and something in my chest tightened at the specific cruelty of a familiar comfort arriving in the hands of the wrong person. "Good morning, Walter." Her voice was warm and slightly tired, the voice of a devoted wife running on too little sleep and too much worry. She set the bag on the bedside table without opening it. The food was not for me. I understood that immediately. It was a prop, something to carry in, so the nurses at the station would see a woman bringing her husband breakfast. She adjusted my blanket. She smoothed it across my chest with both palms, in the same gesture she had used every morning this week. And I understood now that the gesture was not affection. It was maintenance, the way you wipe down a countertop before company arrives. Then her eyes moved to my right wrist. The smartwatch had been there since the accident. It was a simple device, black band, square face, the kind of thing a man my age wears, because his cardiologist suggested monitoring his heart rate, and he obliged without much enthusiasm. Sandra had never paid it particular attention. Why would she? It looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. What Sandra did not know was that 3 hours ago, while she had been asleep in the house in Queens, that she was already mentally redecorating. Pat had leaned close to my ear and explained in a voice below a whisper that the watch's recording application could be activated by a specific sequence of finger movements against the band. Bob had confirmed the technical details by text. The application ran silently. It stored audio locally. It required no network connection and produced no visible notification. Sandra reached towards my wrist. My heart rate spiked. The monitor registered it a sharp uptick that Sandra glanced at with something that was not quite concern. Pat materialized from the supply alcove beside the door with the timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Mrs. Reed," she said, her voice professionally warm, "I need to ask you not to disturb that device. It's part of the cardiac monitoring protocol. Dr. Park ordered it interfaces with the main system. If it gets repositioned, we lose continuity in the data stream, and she'll want it recalibrated, which takes about 2 hours." Sandra looked at Pat with the evaluating expression she used on people she was deciding whether to dismiss. "I was just straightening it," Sandra said. "I understand." Pat smiled with her whole face, the particular smile of someone who has worked with difficult people long enough to make the smile completely unreadable. "I'll take care of it. Dr. Park is very specific about the equipment." Sandra withdrew her hand. Her expression reset to sorrow in under a second, a transition so fast and so complete that I might have doubted what I had seen if I had not spent 8 years watching her perform it. She sat in the chair beside my bed and began talking. She talked about the house, the gutters needed cleaning. She had called someone, but they were backed up for 2 weeks. She talked about the business. A project manager named Steve had called twice. She had told him Walter was unavailable and that Derek would be in touch. She talked about Derek. He was handling things beautifully. She said, so mature, so capable. She did not know what they would do without him. Every sentence was constructed to sound like love and function like information gathering. She was watching my face while she talked, measuring my reactions the way you measure a wall before you decide where to put the door. I gave her nothing. My face was a closed job site. After 20 minutes, she checked her phone, stood, and squeezed my hand once with both of hers. "I'll be back this evening," she said. "Try to rest." She picked up her paper bag, still unopened, and walked out. I listened to her heels disappear down the hallway. I counted to 30. Then Pat stepped to the door, checked the corridor in both directions, and came back to my bedside. She held up her own phone. On the screen was a text from Bob, recording confirmed active. "Audio quality good. Keep it running." I blinked twice. Then from down the hall came a sound that made Pat go very still. She held one finger up, wait, and moved silently to the door. Through the narrow window, she watched the corridor for a long moment. When she turned back, her expression had changed. She stopped at the end of the hall, Pat said quietly. She's on her phone. She thinks she's out of range. Pat's own phone was already in her hand. She had opened the voice memo application and was holding it toward the gap in the door, the way you hold an ear to a wall when you already suspect what you are about to hear. 30 seconds passed. Then Pat brought the phone back and pressed play. Sandra's voice came through the small speaker, low and unhurried and entirely unguarded, the voice she used when she believed no one who mattered was listening. "He's completely gone, Grant. You should see him just lying there. We just need the paperwork to move a little faster." A pause filled with the sound of Sandra shifting her weight. "No, he doesn't understand anything. The doctors said so." Another pause. "Stop worrying. By the time anyone figures out anything is wrong, it'll already be done." The recording ended. Pat lowered the phone. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were bright with something that was not Satan's. It was the focused, controlled anger of a person who had suspected something ugly and had just had it confirmed in full color. She looked at me. I had already activated the sequence on the watch band. 3 small movements against the smooth black surface, practiced and deliberate. Everything Sandra said in this room from this moment forward would be recorded. Pat pulled out her notepad and wrote one word, then held it where I could read it. "Ready," I blinked once. Pat's phone buzzed at 3:47 in the afternoon. She was changing the dressing on my IV line when it happened, a single vibration against the supply tray where she had set it face up, the way nurses do when they are expecting something important and need to see it the moment it arrives. She glanced at the screen. Her hands stopped moving. "Walter," she said quietly. She picked up the phone and angled it so I could see the notification on the screen. It was a security alert from the system Bob had remotely reactivated 2 days ago, the same system I had installed 4 years earlier after a break-in 2 blocks over had made Sandra nervous about the neighborhood. The irony of that was not lost on me. The notification read, "Motion detected. Location home office." Pat opened the live feed without being asked. The image was grainy and slightly overexposed from the afternoon light coming through the office window, but it was clear enough. Sandra stood behind my desk, the one I had bought at an estate sale in Bayside 20 years ago, and refinished myself over a long weekend while Diana read to me from the kitchen doorway. Sandra's back was to the camera. Beside her stood a man I had not seen before. He was tall, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of tan that comes from leisure rather than labor. He was wearing a sport coat on a Tuesday afternoon, which told me everything I needed to know about how he spent his days. He moved through my office with the comfortable ease of someone who had been there before, not hesitating at the bookshelf, going directly to the filing cabinet beside the window, as though he already knew what was in it. Grant. It had to be. The way Sandra turned toward him, when he spoke, the slight lean of her body in his direction. 8 years of marriage had taught me the vocabulary of her attention, and she was paying him the kind of attention she had not paid me in a very long time. They were looking for the will. I had known they would. I had counted on it. 3 weeks before the accident, during a routine meeting at Bob's office to update the charitable giving provisions, I had made a decision that Bob had called excessive, and I had called practical. I had prepared a secondary document, a convincing replica of my previous will, signed and dated, leaving the house in Queens, and a substantial portion of my liquid assets directly to Sandra, with Reed Electric going to Derek. It was the will of a man who had trusted his family completely. It was also entirely fictitious. Bob had argued against it. I had overruled him, which I was allowed to do exactly twice per decade, according to the informal rules of our friendship, and I had filed the fake document in the left drawer of my office desk, beneath a folder labeled Insurance Vehicle, because Sandra was the kind of person who looked for important things in obvious places. On the screen, I watched her find it. She pulled the folder out, opened it, and went very still for a moment that stretched long enough to tell me she was reading carefully. Then she turned to Grant and held the document up, and even through the grainy security footage I could see the change in her posture, the loosening of the shoulders, the slight backward tilt of the head that meant relief had just moved through her body like warm water. Grant said something I could not hear. Sandra laughed. It was the laugh I remembered from our first year together, unguarded, genuine. The laugh she had stopped using around me somewhere between year 2 and year 3. She was using it for him now in my office, holding a document that she believed had just handed her everything. Pat watched the screen beside me. Her jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle working at the corner of it. "She thinks that's real," Pat said. I blinked once. "And the real one is with Bob." One blink. Pat exhaled slowly through her nose. "So you knew they'd come looking." One blink. She looked at me for a long moment, not with surprise, but with the particular expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of a person they thought they had already figured out. "You planned this before the accident," she said. One blink. She set the phone down on the mattress so the feed was still visible and leaned back in her chair. On the screen, Sandra was carefully replacing the folder, smoothing it back exactly as she had found it. Grant was taking photographs of the document with his phone. They were being careful. They were being thorough. They were doing exactly what I had spent 3 weeks hoping they would do. Then Sandra did something I had not anticipated. She walked to the far side of my office, to the wall where Diana's photographs hung. 3 framed pictures, Diana and me at the Grand Canyon. The summer before her diagnosis, Diana holding a newborn Derek in the hospital, Diana and Margaret together at a Queen's block party in 2006, laughing at something off camera, with their heads tilted toward each other, the way women do when they are sharing something that belongs only to them. Sandra took all 3 down. She stacked them against the baseboard, with their faces to the wall, the way you stack things when you are preparing a surface for something else entirely. And then she stood back and looked at the bare wall with the evaluating expression of a person measuring for new shelving. Pat made a sound beside me, small, involuntary, the kind of sound that escapes before a person can decide whether to let it out. I felt something move through my chest that I did not have a name for. It was not grief, exactly. Grief was something I had learned to carry, an old weight I knew how to distribute. This was sharper than grief. This was the specific pain of watching someone erase a person who deserved to be remembered. Diana had chosen those photographs herself. She had stood in this office on a Saturday afternoon, in the last good year, holding each frame up against the wall and asking me which height looked right, and I had said they all looked right, because she was right about everything she put her hands to. A tear ran from the corner of my eye into my hair. I had not been able to cry since the accident. The damage to my nervous system had taken that along with everything else. But something about those photographs facing the wall in my own office released whatever had been locked up since the moment I had woken in this room. Pat saw it. She reached over without a word and covered my hand with hers, not squeezing, just resting there the way Marcus had done 2 nights ago, warm and solid and present. She stayed like that for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet and very certain. "I'm going to find out everything she did to that room," she said. "Every single thing." I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the feeling in my chest had changed. The sharpness was still there. It would probably always be there, but underneath it, something harder had taken root. Diana had spent 30 years believing that the people you loved were worth protecting. She had been right about that, too. I looked at Pat, and blinked, not the careful, deliberate communication blink of the past 2 days, but something more direct. Something that meant then, let's get to work. She did not knock. That was the first thing I noticed about Rose Huang. She pushed the door open, the way people do when they have already decided they belong in the room and are simply informing the room of that fact. She was compact and quick-moving, somewhere in her mid-40s, with close-cropped black hair and the kind of eyes that inventoried a space in the first 3 seconds and filed everything away before most people had finished saying hello. She was carrying a thin manila folder and a cup of coffee that was clearly for herself, and she looked at me the way experienced investigators look at everyone, not unkindly, but without the softening filter that most people apply to hospital rooms and the people in them. "Mr. Reed," she said. "I'm Rose Huang. Bob Whitfield hired me 2 days ago." She pulled the visitor's chair out, with one foot, sat down, and opened the folder across her knees without waiting for an invitation. "I used to work homicide for NYPD, 12 years, then financial crimes for 6. Now I work for myself, which means I work harder and sleep better." She looked up. "Bob says you're sharp. I'll find out if that's true." Pat, standing near the window, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Rose set 3 photographs on the mattress where I could see them. The first showed Sandra standing on the front steps of our house in Queens, gesturing toward the detached garage with one hand, while a well-dressed couple stood beside her taking notes. The second showed Grant's sport coat leisure tan, the same easy movement I had watched through the office camera 2 days ago, holding the front door open for the couple like a Marne welcoming them to his own property. The third was a wide shot, a luxury real estate agent's sign staked into the lawn of my house, partially obscured by Sandra's shoulder, but visible enough. I stared at that third photograph for a long time. 40 years ago, I had stood on that same lawn with Diana, both of us fresh off the elevated train, looking at a house that cost more than I believed we could manage. Diana had said we would figure it out. We had. I had repainted that porch myself 3 times. I had rewired the entire second floor the summer Derek turned 8, because I did not trust the original work. Every corner of that house had my hands in it somewhere. Now Sandra was showing it to buyers. Rose tapped the first photograph. "They've had 2 viewings this week. The agent's name is Clifford Barnes. He specializes in Queens properties in the 600,000 to 1.2 million range." She paused. "Your house would come in at the high end of that. The garage alone adds significant value." Pat's jaw tightened at the window. Rose continued without inflection, the way a person delivers information when they have learned that their own reactions get in the way of other people's processing. "The man in the photographs is Grant Holloway, 44 years old. Divorced twice, currently unlicensed as a financial consultant after a complaint was filed with the New York State Department of Financial Services 3 years ago." She let that sit for a moment. "He and Sandra met at a continuing education seminar for real estate professionals approximately 14 months ago. I have credit card records showing shared hotel stays in 4 separate incidents before your accident. 14 months. I had made Sandra breakfast 14 months ago. I had driven her to her sister's birthday dinner 14 months ago. I had sat across from her at our kitchen table 14 months ago and discussed whether to repaint the living room, and she had laughed at something I said, and I had believed, not with great passion perhaps, but genuinely, that we were 2 people building a shared life. The heart rate monitor ticked upward. I could not stop it. Rose noticed. She did not comment on it. She simply waited the 12 seconds it took for the number to come back down, then continued. "Bob asked me to look specifically at the accident," she said. Her voice dropped slightly, not with emotion, but with the particular care a professional uses when they are about to say something that cannot be unsaid. "The driver of the truck that hit you is named Carl Pruitt, 41 years old, Woodhaven address, 2 prior moving violations. He told the police the sun was in his eyes. She opened to the second page of her folder. Carl Pruitt worked for a demolition subcontractor on 3 separate Reed Electric job sites between 2019 and 2022. He and Sandra attended the same church in Ozone Park until 2021. The room was very quiet. Pat had turned fully away from the window now and was standing with her arms crossed and her weight shifted forward, the posture of a person who has just heard something that has reorganized everything else they thought they knew. Rose looked at me steadily. "I don't believe in coincidences, Mr. Reed. I never did even before 12 years of homicide work made coincidences professionally embarrassing." She tapped the folder. "I also spoke with Raymond Cross yesterday afternoon. He told me that approximately 2 weeks before your accident, Sandra asked him about your regular morning route to the Junction Boulevard site. She was specific about intersections. Ray. I had known Ray Cross for 28 years. He had shown up at my door with a toolbox and a handshake the week I opened. Reed Electric told me he was the best electrician in Queens and intended to prove it, and then spent the next 3 decades doing exactly that. He had stood beside me at Diana's funeral. He had driven me home from the hospital the night Derek broke his arm at 13. If Ray said Sandra had asked about my route, then Sandra had asked about my route, and there was not a version of that fact that led anywhere good. Rose set one final item on the mattress beside the photographs. A single printed page, a document from the New York State Department of Insurance. 3 months before your accident, she said, Sandra filed paperwork increasing your life insurance policy to $500,000. The sole beneficiary listed is Sandra Reed. She paused. Not Derek, not a trust, just Sandra. I looked at the document. I looked at the number. I looked at the date. Then I looked at Rose Huang, and she looked back at me with the expression of a person who has spent 18 years learning to deliver devastating information and still has not figured out a way to make it land softly. I'm going to keep pulling, she said. There's more. There's always more. She collected the photographs from the mattress and slid them back into the folder. Bob said you want the full picture before you make any moves. I blinked once. Good. She stood, picked up her coffee, and took the first sip she had allowed herself since sitting down. Because incomplete pictures get people hurt. She looked at Pat. Nobody outside this room knows I was here. Pat shook her head. Nobody. Rose moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame and looked back at me one final time, not with pity, not with professional distance, but with something that sat closer to respect. You built something real, Mr. Reed, she said. I've seen what people do to real things. She pushed the door open. I'll be back Thursday. The door closed behind her. Pat waited a full minute before she spoke. $500,000, she said. Her voice was very controlled. 3 months before the accident. I blinked once. She pressed her lips together hard, then picked up her notepad and wrote something, turning it so I could read it. Bob needs to see Rose's file. Tonight. I blinked twice, yes, and urgently, and Pat was already reaching for her phone. Marcus came in at 7:43 that evening wearing the same Mets cap and the same sweatshirt, but his face was different. In 3 days, I had learned to read my nephew the way I had always read job sites. The small indicators that told you what was actually happening beneath the surface before anything announced itself officially. A job site that was going to have problems gave you signs 2 days before the problem arrived. A foreman who stopped making eye contact materials, staged in the wrong sequence. A quality of quiet that was slightly too deliberate. Marcus, when he was troubled, went quiet in a specific way, not the easy quiet of a 19-year-old comfortable in a room, but the tight, compressed quiet of someone carrying something heavy and trying to decide whether to set it down. He set his cap on the bedside table. He pulled the chair close. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he reached into the pocket of his sweatshirt and produced his phone. "Uncle Walt," he said. His voice had the particular careful steadiness of someone who has practiced a sentence several times and is now discovering that practice does not fully prepare you for delivery. "I need to show you something, and I need you to know I didn't go looking for it. I just saw it." He turned the phone toward me. The screen showed a group chat. The name at the top of the thread displayed in the clean sans serif font of a standard messaging application read, "Family First." I read the name twice. Then I read the messages. Derek's profile picture was a photograph of him at a Mets game 2 summers ago. I had taken that photograph myself, standing 3 rows behind him, capturing the exact moment the team scored, and his arms went up. Beneath that photograph, in the flat, digital permanence of a text message sent 4 days ago, were the following words. "Old man's basically a vegetable now. We just need to wait it out." Sandra had responded with a laughing emoji. 3 of them stacked. A third number unlisted, no profile picture, had written, "How much longer do you think, Derek? Couple weeks, maybe. Doc said there's no real improvement. We're looking at options." Sandra again, this time with words rather than emoji, the right options. "Don't say too much here. Derek, relax. He's not reading our texts, LOL." The last message had been sent 40 minutes ago. Marcus lowered the phone. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying. I understood, but from the effort of not crying, which is a different and more exhausting thing entirely. He was 19 years old, and he had just read his father describe his grandfather as a vegetable and follow it with LOL, and he was sitting in this hospital room trying to hold himself together, because he understood that falling apart would not help me. He was more like Margaret than he knew. I concentrated on my right hand. The exercises Kevin had begun running me through each night were starting to produce results. Small ones, barely measurable, but real. I found the motion I needed and held it for 3 full seconds against the pain. Marcus read the sign immediately. His ASL had always been faster than his mother's, quicker to interpret, shaped by a childhood of watching adults communicate across rooms at family gatherings. "You already knew," he signed back. It was not a question. I blinked once. Then I signed back slowly, not the words, the intention. He absorbed that. Then he took a screenshot of the entire conversation thread going back 14 days and sent it to himself from 3 different angles so the timestamp and the group name were clearly visible in each image. He did this with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had paid attention when it mattered, and I felt a surge of something that was not quite pride, but lived in the same neighborhood, the recognition of a quality in another person that you had always hoped was there. "I'm sending these to Bob," Marcus said. It was not a question. I blinked once. He typed for 40 seconds, then set the phone face down on his knee and looked at me. "Dad said you don't understand anything," he said. His voice was very flat. He said it to my face, Uncle Walt. 2 days ago in the parking lot, when I told him I was coming to visit. He said... Marcus stopped. His throat worked. "He said you were just a body keeping a bed warm." The heart monitor climbed 8 beats. Marcus watched the number rise and pressed his lips together hard. "I told him I was coming anyway." He picked up his cap from the table and turned it over in his hands, the brim going through his fingers, the way a person handles something familiar when they need something to do with their hands. "He told me I was wasting my time." I signed to him slowly and with great care, "You are not wasting your time." The tears he had been holding back since he walked in the door finally let go, not dramatically, not with the heaving sobs of someone losing control, but in the quiet, unstoppable way that water finds through concrete when the pressure has been building long enough. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his sweatshirt and straightened up immediately, the way young men do when they have decided that emotion is permissible, but only in small, measured amounts. Pat came in then with 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for Marcus, because she had already learned his habits in 3 days, the way good nurses learn everything about a room. She set his cup on the table without comment, looked at his face and then at mine, and understood, without being told, that something significant had just passed between us. She pulled out her own phone. Bob had responded to the file she had sent earlier. She read the message, then held the screen toward me. Sandra Vance. Account opened 22 months ago at a Chase branch in Midtown. $180,000 transferred from joint Reed account over 14 months. Current balance $4,200. Address on file: apartment 7 F 340, West 55th Street, Manhattan. I read the address twice. West 55th Street, a 2-bedroom in a doorman building on the west side of Midtown. I had pulled permits for an electrical job in that building 12 years ago. I remembered the super, a heavy-set man named Augusto, who made very good coffee and complained constantly about the age of the wiring. Sandra had used 14 months of our shared money to build a second life 3 miles from where I worked. Pat watched my face. Then she looked at Marcus. Then she set her phone down on the mattress face up where both of us could see it, and said very quietly, very carefully, what we were all 3 thinking. "Derek doesn't know where that money came from," she said. "Does he?" Marcus looked up sharply. I signed one word: no. Pat nodded slowly. She picked up her notepad. Then at the right moment, she said, writing as she spoke, "He will." Dr. Linda Park did not arrive in scrubs. She came through the door at 11:14 at night, wearing jeans and a dark green fleece jacket, her hospital badge clipped to the zipper. Pull the way people clip it when they have left work, and then turned around and come back because something would not let them stay away. Her hair was down. She was carrying her own coffee, and she looked like a woman who had driven across Queens in the dark to deal with something she had been thinking about since well before her shift ended. Pat met her at the door. They spoke in low voices for 30 seconds with their backs to me, not to exclude me, I understood, but because what they were saying was the kind of thing that needed to be said quietly, even in an empty hallway. Then Dr. Park turned around and looked at me directly. She had been my neurologist since the second day. I had watched her through 11 days of examinations and consultations and careful conversations with Sandra, and I had formed a precise impression of her, a woman who noticed everything said less than she knew, and made her decisions based on information rather than convenience. She had never once in 11 days treated me like furniture. She pulled the chair to my bedside and sat down. She set her coffee on the table. She laced her fingers together over her knees and looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a person who is about to tell you something difficult and has already decided that the difficult thing is better than the alternative. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I owe you an apology and an explanation, and I'm going to give you both." She reached into the pocket of her fleece and produced a folded printout. A medication log. I could see the header format from this distance. The same format I had watched nurses initial every 6 hours since I arrived. "5 days ago," she said, "I noticed a discrepancy in your sedation dosage. The amount being administered was higher than what I had ordered. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger an automatic alert, but enough to matter clinically." She unfolded the printout and smoothed it against her knee. I pulled the camera footage from the medication room for the preceding 48 hours. She paused. Her jaw tightened once, then released. Sandra Reed was in that room for 11 minutes on the afternoon of day 9. She told the floor nurse she was looking for a quiet place to make a phone call. Dr. Park looked at me steadily. There is no reason for a family member to be in the medication room. Ever. The heart rate monitor registered my response before I could suppress it. A hard spike 8 beats, the same involuntary reaction I had produced in Rose's presence 2 days ago, when the information had been bad enough to bypass whatever control I had developed over my own body's honesty. Dr. Park watched the number. She did not look away from it until it came back down. "I want to be precise about what I can and cannot prove," she said, because she was that kind of doctor, the kind who understood that precision was a form of respect. "I cannot prove that Sandra altered your medication. I can prove she was in a room she had no business being in, immediately preceding an unexplained increase in your sedation level, which had the documented clinical effect of slowing your neurological recovery indicators." She refolded the printout. "I've documented all of it in your chart under a notation that reads, 'Medication protocol, irregularity under review.' That notation is now part of your permanent medical record." Pat, standing near the window, exhaled through her nose a long, slow release of breath that had been held too long. Dr. Park reached into her other pocket and produced a second document, a revised medication order already signed and dated with the dosage corrections written in her precise small handwriting. "I've adjusted your protocol to the correct therapeutic level with a documented clinical justification. The adjustment is defensible on its own medical merits." She looked at me. "Sandra will notice you are not deteriorating as expected. I cannot control that. What I can control is making sure that every decision I make about your care is on the record and above reproach." She set the revised order on the bedside table. Then she did something I had not expected. She leaned forward, slightly, elbows on her knees, and spoke in a voice that was no longer the carefully modulated tone of a physician managing a difficult case. It was the voice of a person speaking directly to another person. "I have been a neurologist for 19 years, she said. "I have watched families make terrible decisions at terrible times, and I have given them the benefit of the doubt, because grief makes people into versions of themselves they would not otherwise recognize." She paused. "I am no longer extending that benefit to your family, Mr. Reed. What I saw in your chart is not grief. It is deliberate interference with a patient's recovery." She stood. She picked up her coffee. She looked at Pat. "The counter-petition Bob filed for cognitive competency evaluation, I've agreed to serve as the examining physician." She glanced back at me. "The evaluation will establish that you are fully aware, fully oriented, and fully capable of making your own decisions. Once that is on record, the guardianship petition Derek filed becomes legally untenable." She said the word untenable the way lawyers say it, as a conclusion, not a possibility. "I expect to complete the evaluation within the next 72 hours. Pat nodded once, the tight nod of a person absorbing good news in a situation where good news had been scarce enough to require careful handling. Dr. Park moved toward the door. Then she stopped. "One more thing," she said. She turned back toward me, and for just a moment, the professional composure shifted enough to show the person underneath it, a woman who had driven across Queens at 11 o'clock at night because she could not in good conscience do otherwise. "I looked up your company, Reed Electric. My father's hardware store in Flushing was rewired by your crew in 2009. He talked about the quality of the work for 3 years." She looked at me for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Get better, Mr. Reed," she said. "People like you are in short supply." The door closed behind her. Pat stood at the window for a long moment without speaking. Outside, the elevated train rumbled past on its overnight schedule, fewer cars than the daytime runs, the sound slightly more hollow in the empty streets. The way familiar things sound different when heard in the dark. When Pat finally turned around, her eyes were very bright. 72 hours, she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripping the windowsill behind her were not. After that evaluation, they lose the guardianship petition. They lose legal control over your treatment. They lose... She stopped. Started again. They lose Walter. I looked at her. Then I signed slowly and deliberately the word I had been building toward since the moment I had first opened my eyes in this room and heard my wife's voice decide my worth in a single sentence. Gala. Pat stared at the sign. Her expression shifted from relief to something more complicated, the particular look of a person realizing that the man in the hospital bed has been 3 steps ahead of everyone in the room, since before most of them knew there was a game being played. She reached for her notepad. How many days away? I blinked once for each week. 3 blinks. 3 weeks. She wrote the number down and underlined it twice. Then from her phone came the soft chime of a message from Rose Huang. Pat opened it, read it, and looked up at me with an expression that had moved past complicated and into something closer to awe. She has audio, Pat said quietly. From a restaurant in Forest Hills. She says we need to hear it. Tonight. Before I expose the exact moment everything unraveled in that private dining room, drop the word exposed or type the number 100 in the comments right now so I know you are still with me on this journey. And kindly note the events unfolding. Next, incorporate adapted creative elements for dramatic and illustrative impact. If you prefer not to continue, feel free to pause right here. Bob arrived at 7:50 in the morning, carrying a laptop, and the particular expression of a man who has been awake since 3 and has made his peace with that fact. He set the laptop on the bedside table without preamble. No greeting beyond a single nod in my direction. No small talk, none of the careful social lubrication that most people applied to difficult conversations. After 25 years of friendship, Bob Whitfield understood that I did not need him to ease me into things. I needed him to show me what he had found. Pat closed the door. She pulled the blinds on the interior window that faced the nursing station, a routine adjustment. Nothing that would attract attention, and positioned herself near the foot of the bed where she could see both the laptop screen and the hallway door simultaneously. Bob opened the laptop. He turned the screen toward me. Rose recorded this 2 nights ago, he said. Private dining room at a restaurant in Forest Hills. The table was booked under Grant Holloway's name. Rose had been tracking his credit card activity for 6 days. He paused. The audio quality is good. I need you to be prepared for what you're about to hear. In 25 years, Bob had never once told me to prepare myself for anything. He was not a man who issued warnings he did not believe were necessary. He pressed play. The recording began with the ambient sound of a restaurant, the low murmur of other tables, the distant sound of glassware, the particular acoustic quality of a room with high ceilings and upholstered chairs that absorbed some frequencies and reflected others. I had eaten in rooms like that. Diana and I had celebrated our 10th anniversary in a room like that. Then Sandra's voice came through the speaker close to the microphone, unguarded, in the way people become unguarded in private rooms when they believe the walls belong to them. I honestly thought he would be further along by now, she said. One way or the other. A man's voice, Grant the leisure tan, and the sport coat speaking now in the flat, transactional tone of someone discussing a business timeline. What does the doctor say? That he's not progressing. Sandra's voice carried the particular satisfaction of a person reporting good news. The rehabilitation indicators are poor. She said it could be months before they have a clearer picture. Derek's voice from slightly farther from the microphone. Months is too long. Months is fine, Sandra said. We have the filing ready. Once the evaluation comes back the way we need it to the guardianship transfers, and we control everything, the treatment decisions, the discharge, planning, all of it. Grant again. And the house. Clifford has 2 more viewings scheduled. A pause. The sound of a wine glass being set down. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, it'll already be done. Derek said something I could not fully hear. His voice dropped at the end of the sentence. But Sandra's response was clear. "Stop worrying," she said. "He doesn't understand anything. He never did. He was always too busy with that company to pay attention to what was happening in his own house." The recording ended. The room held the particular silence of a space in which something irreversible has just occurred. Not a comfortable silence, not a thoughtful one, but the silence of a door that has closed and will not open again. Bob reached over and turned the laptop screen down without closing it. He looked at me steadily, the way he had looked at me across tables and courtrooms and hospital rooms for 25 years, and he waited. The heart monitor held steady. I had expected the spike, I had braced for it, the way you brace for a wave you can see coming, and the preparation had worked barely. What I felt was not the sharp physical jolt of the past week's revelations. It was something slower and heavier, the particular weight of a thing you have known was true, and have now heard confirmed in the voice of someone who said their vows to you on a Saturday in October, and meant them, or had seemed to, or had performed meaning well enough that the difference had not mattered until now. She was always too busy with that company to pay attention to what was happening in his own house. I had built that company for 40 years. I had built it so that Diana would not have to worry, so that Derek would have something solid to stand on, so that the people who worked for me could send their own kids to college and fix their own roofs and take their own families to dinner on their anniversaries. I had not built it so that Sandra could use it as evidence of my inadequacy in a restaurant in Forest Hills. Bob opened a second file on the laptop. He turned the screen back toward me. "Rose pulled Sandra's public social media accounts going back 14 months, he said. He scrolled to a specific post, a photograph, a restaurant table set with candles and wine glasses, and the kind of food that came with a 3-week reservation wait list. The timestamp in the corner read the date of the night Dr. Brooks had stood outside my room and told Sandra that my condition was critical and the next 24 hours would be significant. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Life is short. Live it." 347 people had liked the post. 12 had left comments expressing how beautiful the food looked. Pat made a sound beside me, short, sharp, involuntary. The sound of someone who has absorbed one too many things in a short period of time and has briefly lost control of their response to it. I looked at the timestamp. I looked at the caption. I looked at the food on the table, the wine glasses, the candles. Then I looked at Bob. He held my gaze without flinching. In 25 years, Bob Whitfield had never once looked away from something difficult, because looking away would have been easier. It was the quality I had always valued most in him, and I valued it now more than I had words for which was appropriate, because I did not currently have words. "We have the restaurant audio," he said quietly. "We have the social media post with the timestamp. We have Rose's photographs of the house viewings. We have the medication record Dr. Park filed. We have the financial records from Sandra's secondary account." He closed the laptop. "Walter, I have been a lawyer for 30 years. I have enough." I held his gaze. Then I signed slowly, and with complete deliberateness, the 2 words I had been building toward since the morning had opened my eyes in this room, and understood exactly what kind of fight I was in. Not yet. Bob's jaw tightened. He recognized the expression on my face. He had seen it across enough negotiating tables to know what it meant when I used it, which was that I had calculated something he had not finished calculating and was prepared to wait for him to catch up. "The gala," he said. It was not a question. I blinked once. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee, leaned back in his chair, and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man reassessing a timeline. 20 years of that foundation, he said finally. 400 people in one room. Board members, city council, the press. He brought his eyes back down to mine. You want witnesses? I blinked once. Pat had been standing at the foot of the bed through all of it, arms crossed, weight forward, absorbing everything without interrupting. Now she spoke for the first time since Bob had pressed play. How long? She asked. Her voice was very controlled, but her eyes were bright with something that was equal parts fury and fierce concentrated hope. I signed the answer without hesitation. 3 weeks. Bob nodded slowly. He reached into his coat pocket and produced his notepad, the same small notepad he had carried into this room 14 days ago before sunrise, when Walter Reed had been a man with no voice and nowhere to put his anger. He opened it to a fresh page and wrote 3 words at the top. Then he turned it so I could read it. 3 weeks. Everything. Kevin Doherty showed up the first night at 11:30 carrying a duffel bag and an attitude. He was 53 years old, built like a man who had spent 3 decades helping broken people rebuild themselves and had absorbed some of their determination in the process, broad through the shoulders, economical in his movements, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that unnecessary motion was a form of noise. Pat had worked with him at a veterans rehabilitation center in the Bronx 4 years earlier. She trusted him. She had told me the way you trust a tool that has never once failed you when the job was hard. He set the duffel on the floor, looked at me without the softening filter that most people applied in hospital rooms, and said, Pat tells me you used to run electrical on rooftops. I blinked once. Good, he said, pulling a resistance band from the bag. Because what we're doing tonight is basically the same thing. Except the roof is your nervous system, and the wiring is your muscle memory, and nobody's going to pull your permit if you take longer than scheduled. He positioned himself beside the bed. Let's find out what you've got. What I had, it turned out, was less than I wanted and more than I expected. The first night, Kevin established a baseline testing each muscle group with the methodical patience of a man who understood that impatience was the enemy of recovery and had made his professional reputation by eliminating it entirely from his practice. My right hand had the most function. My left shoulder could produce approximately 30% of its normal range. My legs were the problem, not absent, Kevin was careful to clarify, but disconnected the signals from my brain arriving at my muscles, like calls going to a phone that was taking its time answering. The line's still there, he told me after the first session, packing his bands back into the duffel. We just need to wake it up. He looked at me with the directness of a man who did not believe in decorating difficult information. It's going to hurt. Every night. For a while. I blinked once. Good, he said. Pain means the line's transmitting. He came back the second night, and the third, and every night after that, arriving between 11 and 11:30, when the floor had quieted to its overnight rhythm, and the nursing station was staffed by people who had learned to find Pat's late-night equipment adjustments unremarkable. Beverly Cross contributed to this without being asked. She had introduced herself to the overnight charge nurse 2 weeks earlier as a family friend who sometimes brought Pat coffee during difficult cases, and had used that relationship to ensure that the supply closet at the end of the hall was unlocked and unmonitored between 11 and 1. Beverly Cross was 67 years old and had spent 22 years watching me from across the fence line between our properties, and she had apparently been waiting for an opportunity to be useful in a serious way for most of that time. She showed up for it with the quiet, total commitment of someone who had survived her own version of this story and understood exactly what was at stake. The exercises were brutal. That is not a word I use carelessly. I had spent 40 years in physical work, climbing, lifting, pulling wire through walls that did not want to give it passage. I understood physical discomfort as a professional category. What Kevin put me through each night was something different, because the effort of commanding a body that had partially stopped receiving commands produced a specific kind of pain that lived below muscle and above bone in the nervous system itself, a deep electrical wrongness that made every session feel like rewiring a panel with the breakers still live. More than once I wanted to stop. Kevin never let me. "You built Reed Electric from nothing," he said one night approximately 12 days into the sessions, when I had managed to hold a standing position for 4 seconds between the parallel bars he had brought in a piece at a time and assembled against the far wall. "How many times did you want to walk off a job in the first 5 years? I thought about it. Then I signed every week." He grinned for the first time since I had known him. "And you didn't?" I blinked once. "Same thing," he said. "Except this time the job is your own body, and you don't get to hire someone else to finish it." Tommy came every afternoon. He was 17 years old, Derek's son, a junior at Forest Hills High School, who wore the same pair of beat-up Nikes 3 days out of 5 and carried a backpack so heavy with textbooks it had permanently altered his posture. He knew nothing about the legal proceedings, nothing about the recordings, nothing about the network of people working in the dark around the edges of his family's collapse. He knew only that his grandfather was in a hospital bed and that visiting him was the right thing to do. He came anyway. Every afternoon, without being asked, without being reminded. He would set his backpack on the floor, pull the chair close, and read aloud hot children's books. Not anything selected for the purpose of keeping a patient company, but whatever he was currently reading for school or for himself. Steinbeck 1 week. A biography of Lou Gehrig the next. A history of the Brooklyn Dodgers that he had found at a street sale on Austin Street and bought for $3 because the cover looked interesting. I could not respond to him. I could not tell him what his voice meant in those afternoon hours between Kevin's night sessions, a human sound that had no agenda, no calculation, no performance of grief or affection. Tommy read to me because he wanted to, and that wanting was the cleanest thing in the room. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into my hospitalization, he set his book down mid-chapter and looked at me directly. His jaw had the same set as Derek's, the same bone structure, the same tendency to tighten when he was thinking hard, but his eyes were Diana's, and looking into them was like being handed something I had thought was lost. "Grandpa," he said. His voice was careful in the way of a young person saying something they have been turning over for a long time. "I don't know what's going on exactly, but I know something is." He held my gaze. "I just want you to know that when you get better, and you are getting better, I can tell I'm going to be there. Whatever you need." The evening after Tommy said that Kevin ran me through the hardest session we had attempted, at the end of it gripping the parallel bars with both hands while Kevin counted, I pushed up from the bent knee position and stood fully upright for the first time since the accident. 7 seconds. Then my legs gave out, and Kevin caught me and Pat pressed her hands over her mouth to keep the sound in, and I hung between the bars breathing in ragged pulls that sounded nothing like a man who had just won something and felt exactly like one. Kevin steadied me. He did not celebrate. He did not make a speech. He simply said, with the flat certainty of a man who had watched people rebuild themselves from worse positions than mine, "Same time tomorrow." That was the night Sandra came in for her evening visit and stood at the foot of my bed and said with a sympathy that had never been anything but performance, "The doctor says you're not progressing, Walter. I've been looking at some long-term care options, somewhere comfortable, somewhere you'd be looked after properly." She reached over and patted my hand. I looked at the ceiling. 7 seconds, I thought. Tonight I stood for 7 seconds. Tomorrow it would be 8. Marcus called Pat at 9:17 that evening. I knew because Pat's phone lit up on the supply tray beside my bed, and because she answered it with the particular stillness of someone who has been half expecting a call and is now discovering that being prepared for something does not fully absorb the impact of its arrival. She listened for 40 seconds without speaking. Then she said, "Don't move. I'm coming to you." She looked at me before she left. "Marcus found something," she said. "In your wife's old email account." She paused on the word wife the way people pause on words that have become complicated. "He says you need to hear it first, before anyone else." She was back in 11 minutes with Marcus beside her, his Mets cap in his hands, and his face carrying the expression I had learned to associate with information that could not be unfound once it had been found. He sat in the chair beside my bed and set his phone on the mattress where I could see the screen, and he looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "Uncle Walt," he said, "I need to ask you something before I show you this, and I need you to answer me honestly." He held my gaze. "Did you know?" I blinked once, then twice. I did not know what he was about to show me. I needed him to understand that clearly. He nodded. He turned the phone toward me. The screen showed an email thread. The account header read, "Diana Reed," and the sight of her name in that clean digital font. Her name, her account. The inbox she had maintained with the same careful organization she had brought to everything in her life produced a pain in my chest that had nothing to do with my injuries, and everything to do with the 11 years I had spent learning to carry her absence. Marcus had accessed the account using the password Diana had written in the small leather notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. The notebook I had not been able to throw away that still sat in that drawer in the house in Queens, because throwing it away had always felt like a finality I was not ready to confirm. The email at the top of the thread was dated 19 years ago. The sender was a physician's office. The subject line read, "Lab results D. Read, please confirm receipt." Marcus scrolled down. Below it was a reply not from Diana, but from a secondary address I did not immediately recognize. It took me 3 seconds to place it as an email account Sandra had used before we married, an account I had seen only once or twice in the early years of our relationship. The reply read, "Confirmed. Please direct all future correspondence regarding this patient to this address. The patient has requested that results be filtered through a family representative due to anxiety around medical information." Signed, Sandra Vance. Sandra Vance. Her name before she became Sandra Reed. 19 years ago, Sandra had not yet entered our lives. We had not met until 16 years ago, which meant this was not a coincidence of timing. It was premeditation of a different kind entirely. Rose had dug deeper and found the connection. Sandra had worked briefly as a medical billing coordinator at one of Diana's physician networks in 2006. She had access to patient rosters. She had known about Diana long before Diana knew about her. The account she had created under the name Sandra Vance was not a mistake. It was infrastructure. Marcus scrolled further. More emails, more intercepts. A pattern that ran for 14 months, spanning 3 different physicians' offices and 2 separate laboratory services. Results that should have reached Diana arriving instead at an address Sandra controlled, with brief confirmations sent back to the medical offices, indicating that the patient had been informed and was managing well. Diana had not been informed. Diana had spent 14 months believing her annual screenings were unremarkable, because no one had told her otherwise. By the time she saw her own results, by the time a new physician, a younger one who insisted on speaking directly with the patient, finally reached Diana on her personal phone and read her the numbers, the window for early intervention had closed. I had held Diana's hand in a hospital room, not unlike this one, while a doctor used the word terminal and I had believed it was a cruelty without an author. Bad luck. The specific randomness of a disease that chose people without reason or pattern. It had not been random. Marcus lowered the phone. His hands were shaking not slightly, not the fine tremor of controlled emotion, but the full, visible shake of a young man who has just understood something that has reorganized everything he thought he knew about his family. "Dad doesn't know," he said. His voice was very quiet. "He has no idea she did this." I looked at him steadily. "He needs to know," Marcus said. "Before the gala, he needs to know who she actually is." I signed slowly. "Can you do it?" Marcus pressed his lips together. His jaw tightened and released the way Derek's did, the way Tommy's did, the family resemblance, moving through 3 generations of the same bone structure, carrying the same response to difficulty. "Yeah," he said. "I can do it." He left at 10:40. Pat sat beside my bed in the quiet that followed, and did not try to fill it, because she understood by now that some information required space to settle before it could be carried. At 11:53, my door opened. Derek Reed walked in alone. He was not wearing his usual jacket. He was in a gray t-shirt and jeans, the clothes of a man who had left wherever he was in a hurry and had not thought about what he was wearing. His face was the color of old concrete, not pale exactly, but drained of something that had previously given it warmth and dimension. He stood inside the door for a moment, looking at me, and I looked back at him, and between us was 19 years of a dead woman's intercepted mail, and 14 months of a disease that had been allowed to advance without resistance. Pat moved toward the door. Derek shook his head. "Stay," he said. His voice came out rough and broken at the edges, the voice of a man who had been crying in his car for however long it had taken him to drive here. "Please." Pat stayed. Derek crossed the room and stood at my bedside. He was 32 years old, and he looked in that moment about 17, the age Tommy was now, the age Derek had been when Diana died, and I had held him in a hospital hallway and told him that we would figure it out, that we always did. He reached out and put his hand over mine on the mattress. His hand was shaking. "Dad," he said. The word came out stripped of everything except what it actually was, not a title, not a social function, but a specific cry directed at a specific person, the way children say it when they are frightened and have nowhere else to take it. "I didn't know about Mom." His voice broke on the last word, and he stopped and pressed his free hand over his mouth and stood there for a long moment, with his shoulders heaving and his breath coming in the ragged, uncontrolled way of someone who has held something too tightly for too long and has finally lost their grip on it entirely. I could not hold him. I could not speak to him. I could not do any of the things a father does when his son is standing at his bedside falling apart. What I could do was turn my hand over under his and hold on. He felt it. His breath hitched. He looked down at our hands, then up at my face, and something moved through his expression that I recognized, because I had felt it myself in a hospital room 19 years ago, in the specific moment when the worst thing that had ever happened to me became undeniable. He understood now what he had been standing beside. After a long time, he straightened. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at me with the red-rimmed, scoured expression of a person who has just finished one version of their life and has not yet begun to understand the next one. "Tell me what to do," he said. I signed one word to Marcus, who had come back in and was standing quietly near the door, his own eyes very bright. "Bob." Bob came back on a Thursday morning 7 days before the gala, carrying a leather portfolio so full it strained the zipper. He was dressed properly. This time navy suit, no tie. The particular combination of a man who had come from his office and intended to conduct serious business, but had made one small concession to the informality of a hospital room. He set the portfolio on the bedside table, unzipped it, with the careful deliberation of someone who had organized its contents in a specific order and intended to present them that way, and looked at me with an expression that said he had not slept well and was not bothered by that fact. "Derek called me at midnight," he said. "We talked for 2 hours. He pulled a chair close and sat down. He's in, all the way." I blinked once. Bob nodded. "He wants to testify if it comes to that. He's already given me a written statement about the guardianship filing his name was on the LLC that retained the law firm, and he's willing to explain exactly how that happened and who directed it." He paused. "He also told me about the contracts." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a stack of documents held together with a binder clip, photocopies of signatures on subcontracting agreements, consulting fees, vendor arrangements. I recognized some of the company names and none of the authorization signatures, because the authorization signatures were not mine. Over the past 18 months, Bob said, Sandra and Derek signed 11 separate agreements under their own names using Reed Electric's client relationships as leverage to generate personal consulting fees. The agreements are structured to look like standard referral arrangements, but the fees bypass the company entirely. He set the stack on the mattress. Under New York law, that constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and potentially tortious interference with business relations. The liability attaches to them personally. He let that settle. "They didn't inherit a company," he said. "They signed themselves into a set of obligations." 40 years of watching people underestimate the paperwork had taught me that the most dangerous moment in any transaction was the one where someone assumed they understood what they were signing. Sandra had looked at Reed Electric and seen an asset. She had not looked carefully enough to see that assets and liabilities were attached at the hip, and that the liabilities followed the signatures. Bob reached into the portfolio again and produced a single document thicker than the other's cream-colored paper, the weight and texture of something that had been prepared with care. "Your new will," he said. He laid it on the mattress in front of me. "I need you to confirm you want to proceed." I read it as completely as my position allowed, the formal language of bequest and designation, the careful legal architecture that Bob had spent 30 years learning to build. Sandra's name appeared once in the section that read, "To Sandra Reed, I bequeath the sum of $1, this amount being intentional and not the result of oversight or omission." Derek's name appeared in the identical language immediately below. Everything else, the company, the house, the investment accounts, the contents of Diana's trust, moved to a newly established charitable foundation, bearing Diana's name with a board of trustees that included Bob Ray Cross and Dr. Linda Park. I blinked once. Bob uncapped a pen and held it between 2 fingers where I could see it. "I'm going to need your hand," he said. "Derek witnessed that you have full cognitive function. Dr. Park's evaluation is on record. This signature will hold." The signing took 11 minutes. My hand was steadier than it had been at any point since the accident. The weeks of Kevin's sessions had produced something measurable in my grip and my control, and I wrote my name with the slow, deliberate pressure of a man who understood the weight of what he was putting his name to. Bob witnessed it. Pat witnessed it. He capped the pen, slid the will back into the portfolio, and zipped it closed. "Now," he said, "Sandra." He pulled out his phone and read from the screen. "Yesterday afternoon, Sandra filed an emergency petition for plenary guardianship in Queens County Surrogates Court. Plenary guardianship, if granted, would give her complete legal authority over your person and your estate, medical decisions, financial decisions, where you live, how your assets are managed." He set the phone face down on his knee. "She filed at 2:17 in the afternoon." He looked at me steadily. Our counterpetition was filed at 9:45 in the morning, a pause that lasted exactly long enough. 48 hours before hers. The corners of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood as one the expression of a man who had spent 30 years being careful and was allowing himself briefly to appreciate the results of that care. "The judge assigned to the case is Honorable Patricia Osei," he said. "She has a reputation for thorough review of competency claims and zero tolerance for procedurally premature filings." He recapped the pen he was no longer holding. "Sandra's petition will be reviewed in light of Dr. Park's evaluation, Derek's statement, and the cognitive competency documentation we've been building for 3 weeks. The petition will not succeed." Pat exhaled from the window long and slow, the release of a breath she had been holding since the moment Sandra had first walked into this room, carrying flowers and performance. A knock at the door. Not the sharp knock of hospital staff, but the soft, tentative knock of someone who was not certain of their welcome. Pat opened it. Beverly Cross stood in the hallway holding a small envelope. She was wearing her good coat, the navy wool one she saved for church and serious occasions, and her expression had the particular quality of a woman who has decided that the time for waiting has passed. "I know I'm not family," she said to Pat, "but I've got something for him." Pat stepped aside. Beverly walked to my bedside with the careful step of a woman in her late 60s who had learned to move through the world with deliberate attention. She set the envelope on the mattress beside my hand and looked at me directly, with the softening filter of pity, with the careful distance of someone managing their own discomfort, but with the clear, warm regard of a person who had known me for 22 years and was not confused about who I was. "I'll be in the front row," she said. "I've been waiting 22 years to watch you win something, Walter Reed." Her voice was very steady. "Don't make me wait any longer." She left without waiting for an answer, which was exactly right, because Beverly Cross had always understood that some things did not require a response, only a witness. Pat picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a note card in Beverly's careful handwriting, the penmanship of a woman who had grown up when penmanship was taught as a form of respect. She held it where I could read it. "I'll be in the front row. I've been waiting for this for 22 years. I read it twice. Then for the first time in 34 days, I smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression I had been managing since the accident. Not the slight softening around the eyes that Pat had learned to read as acknowledgement. A real smile. The kind that arrived without permission and stayed without apology. The kind that Diana used to say was the only version of my face she actually trusted. Bob looked up from the portfolio. He saw it. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent 3 decades preparing for moments that almost never come, 6 days, Walt. Sandra came at 6:15 wearing a dress she had not worn to the hospital before. It was black, long, the kind of dress that required a specific occasion to justify itself, and she had paired it with the pearl earrings I had given her on our 3rd anniversary. The ones she had said she loved, the ones I had chosen, because Diana had once mentioned that pearls suited Sandra's coloring, and I had filed the observation away the way I filed everything Diana said, carefully, and with the intention of using it well. Sandra had worn those earrings to the most important evenings of the past 8 years. She was wearing them now to visit a man she believed was dying. She stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me with an expression of such practiced sorrow that I found myself, despite everything, briefly astonished by the consistency of the performance. 8 years. She had maintained this for 8 years. "I wish you could be there tomorrow night, Walter," she said. Her voice carried the specific warmth of genuine feeling, which was the most dangerous thing about Sandra. She had spent so long performing warmth that it had become indistinguishable from the real thing, even to me, even now, even knowing everything I knew. 20 years of that company. You built something extraordinary. She smoothed the blanket across my legs. I'll accept the award on your behalf. I'll make sure everyone knows what it meant to you. She stood there for another few minutes, talking about the evening's arrangements, the venue, the guest list. She mentioned Derek would be making a brief statement about the future direction of Reed Electric. She mentioned the foundation's board had been very understanding. She mentioned she had chosen white lilies for the centerpieces because they were elegant and appropriate. Diana had loved wildflowers. Black-eyed Susans, specifically from the garden she had kept along the back fence in the years when Derek was small. Sandra knew this. Sandra had always known this. She kissed my forehead when she left. Her perfume lingered in the room after the door closed, and Pat stood near the window saying nothing for a full 30 seconds, which was Pat's way of giving the air time to clear. Then she crossed the room and opened the window 2 inches. "Kevin's coming at 10, she said. Her voice had the particular steadiness of someone who has identified the next task and is moving toward it. Last session. He arrived at 10:03, duffel over his shoulder, and he looked at me the way he had looked at me every night for 3.5 weeks, assessing, calibrating, deciding what the situation required. Then he unzipped the duffel and began setting up without preamble because Kevin Doherty did not believe in preamble when there was work to be done. The session was different from every previous one. Not harder exactly. We had already found the upper limit of what my body could produce in a single night, and Kevin was too experienced to push past it the evening before I needed to perform. But there was a quality to it that I had not felt before, a sense of arrival rather than progress. The specific feeling of a man who has been building towards something for a long time and can finally see the shape of what he has built. 20 steps. 22, 25. Kevin counted each one in a low, even voice, the way a spotter counts reps, not to encourage but to mark. Pat stood near the door. I moved along the parallel bars with the grinding, effortful care of someone who understood that each step was a negotiation and not a given, but I moved, and the movement held. And at 25, I stopped and stood, and Kevin said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Drop the bars." I looked at him. "For 3 seconds," he said. "Both hands, let go." I let go. The floor did not come up to meet me. The room did not tilt. My legs, which had spent 3.5 weeks relearning the basic grammar of bearing weight, held the sentence together. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Kevin stepped forward, and I gripped the bars again, and the effort of those 5 seconds sent a wave of exhaustion through me so complete that Pat had to help Kevin get me back to the bed. But the 5 seconds had happened, and Kevin stood at the foot of the bed, looking at me with the expression he reserved for results that had exceeded his clinical expectations. "Tomorrow," he said, "you walk in under your own power. No bars, no chair." He zipped the duffel. "You stop when you need to stop and not before." He picked up the bag. "And you don't fall." He left at 11:40. At 11:58, my phone, the one Pat had been managing for me, reading messages aloud each evening, buzzed with an incoming call. Pat answered it on speaker and held it near my ear. Ray Cross's voice filled the small room. He sounded the way he always sounded, which was like a man standing on solid ground and inviting you to join him there. "Boss," he said. 28 years of working together had never produced a different greeting, and I had long since stopped expecting one. "I talked to Bob this afternoon. He told me the plan." A pause, the brief, comfortable silence of 2 people who did not need to fill every gap. "I'll be at the service entrance at 8 tomorrow. I've got Darnell and Stevie with me, both been with us 18 years each." Another pause. "Nobody gets through that door without us knowing about it." Pat looked at me. I blinked twice. She said into the phone, "He heard you, Ray." Ray's voice came back quieter, stripped of its usual working-day efficiency. "Walt," he said, "I've been pulling wire alongside you for 28 years. I watched you build something from nothing." A pause. I watched her walk into it. His voice tightened at the edges, not with anger exactly, but with the particular feeling of a man who has been patient for a long time and can finally see the end of the patience. "Tomorrow you walk back in and you take it back." A breath. "I'll be at the door." The call ended. Pat set the phone down. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms, where something has just been confirmed that was already true. A quietness that felt like completion rather than absence. Outside the window, Queens was doing what it always did at midnight, which was exactly what it did at noon, which was move and breathe, and carry itself forward, with the specific, inexhaustible energy of a place that had never once in its history waited for permission to continue. I had driven those streets for 40 years. I had pulled wire in those buildings, eaten in those diners, ridden that elevated train in every season. This city did not owe me anything, and I did not owe it anything, and we had built something together anyway, the way people build things when they are simply in the same place at the same time and choose to make something of it. Pat came back from the window carrying something folded over her arm. The navy suit. Beverly had pressed it. I could see the sharp crease along the trouser leg, the careful work of a woman who ironed the way she did everything with the full weight of her attention. Pat laid it over the chair beside my bed. She straightened the jacket lapel once unnecessarily, then stepped back and looked at it and then at me. "Tommy called this afternoon," she said. "He asked if he could sit with me tomorrow." Her voice was very quiet. I told him yes. She turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft glow of the monitoring equipment. "Sleep," she said. "You have somewhere to be tomorrow." The ballroom held 350 people. Tonight, every seat was filled. I could hear it from the service corridor, the layered sound of hundreds of conversations, producing something that felt less like talking and more like weather. Somewhere inside that sound were people who had built neighborhoods alongside me for 20 years. People who deserved the truth. Pat stood beside me without speaking. She was holding the cane. I had not asked her to take it. She understood without being told that I would need my hands free. I was wearing the navy suit. Beverly had pressed it so precisely, the lapels lay flat without effort. Standing in the dim corridor, I felt for the first time in 35 days like a man dressed for the occasion he was actually attending. Through the double doors, Sandra's voice came through clearly. 20 years ago, Walter Reed started Reed Electric with a second-hand van and a toolbox. A pause. "He can't be with us tonight. I am honored to accept this recognition on his behalf." Applause. Pat looked at me. I gripped the cane once, then held it out toward her. She took it without a word. I pushed the doors open. The sound hit me first, 350 people, the smell of food and flowers, chandelier light, blazing off white tablecloths. Beverly was in the front row, exactly where Pat had said wearing her good coat. Tommy sat beside her, back straight, hands flat on his knees, holding himself together through sheer will. Beverly saw me first. She stood up, one person rising from a chair. But it moved through the room like a current, heads turning one by one, the domino of silence spreading backward, until 350 people understood simultaneously that something was happening that was not on the program. Sandra stopped speaking mid-sentence. I walked. Each step was a negotiation between my intention and my body's willingness. The cane was not in my hand. My shoes made a sound on the polished hardwood floor, not dramatic, not designed for effect. Just the honest sound of a man crossing a room under his own power. Click, click, click. Raycross fell into step 3 paces behind me without a word. I felt his presence at my back, the way you feel a solid wall, something that will not move regardless of what comes at it from the front. I climbed the 4 steps to the stage. I held out my hand. Sandra's fingers released the microphone with the lack of resistance of someone who has run out of alternatives. I turned to face the room. 350 faces. People who had given Reed Electric the best years of their working lives. I raised the microphone. "I heard everything," I said. Behind Sandra, the projection screen began to glow. The first thing the screen showed was a timestamp. November 14th. The night Dr. Brooks had stood outside my room and told Sandra that the next 24 hours would determine everything. The night Sandra had posted a photograph of a candlelit dinner table at a restaurant in Forest Hills with the caption, "Life is short. Live it." 350 people read those words above a timestamp that told them exactly where Sandra Reed had been the night her husband's life hung in the balance. The room did not gasp. It went the specific silence of people absorbing something that cannot be taken back. Sandra's hand moved toward the microphone I was holding. Bob stepped onto the stage from the left, positioned himself between us, and said nothing. He did not need to. The screen changed. The group chat. White text on gray background. The group name at the top, Family First. Derek's message beneath it. "Old man's basically a vegetable now. We just need to wait it out." Sandra's response, 3 laughing emoji displayed in front of every board member, every city council representative, every employee who had given Reed Electric the best years of their working lives. Someone at a table near the back made a sound, short, involuntary, the sound of a person who has just understood something they cannot unfeel. Sandra turned toward Derek. Derek was not looking at her. He was looking at the floor, and his jaw was working in the way of someone who has just watched their own words, projected at 40 times their original size, and is discovering that context changes everything. The screen changed again. Bank records. The account name Sandra Holloway. 14 months of transfers from the joint Reed account. The address on file, apartment 7F 340 West 55th Street, Manhattan. A woman near the front, one of the foundation's longest-serving board members, a woman who had known Diana, pressed both hands over her mouth. Then the final image. The bedroom in the house on the corner of my street in Queens. The room I had shared with Diana for 22 years before Sandra moved her photographs to the wall and her presence into the spaces Diana had left. The footage came from the home security system Walter had installed 4 years earlier, the same system Sandra had asked him to set up after a neighbor's break-in. Walter owned the system. Walter owned the house. Every frame of footage on that server belonged to him, and Rose had retrieved it with Bob's authorization on his behalf. Sandra and Grant standing in Walter's bedroom had been recorded by Walter's own cameras in Walter's own home. The room absorbed what it showed in a silence so complete that the ventilation system was the only sound. Derek's face had gone the color of old plaster. 2 men in dark suits entered the ballroom from the side entrance, no uniforms, no drama. The quiet professionalism of people who understood that the situation had already resolved itself and their role was administrative. One approached Bob and accepted a document binder with a brief nod. The other looked toward the stage. "Mrs. Reed?" His voice was conversational, almost gentle. "We need a few minutes of your time." Sandra looked at me. In 8 years of marriage, I had seen her face in every register it possessed. I had seen her happy and calculating and bored and performing and pulled. I had never seen what I saw now, the specific expression of a person discovering that the story they have been telling themselves has reached its final page, and the ending is not the one they wrote. She walked off the stage between the 2 men without speaking. At the AV table, Derek closed the laptop. He looked up at me across the length of the ballroom, 32 years old, his mother's jaw and Diana's eyes, and 40 years of my stubbornness somewhere in the set of his shoulders, and he nodded once. Then Beverly Cross stood up. She began to clap. It started slowly, her two hands in that front row, the sound of one person deciding that what she had just witnessed deserved acknowledgement. Then Tommy beside her. Then Ray at the door. Then the woman who had pressed her hands over her mouth. Then the table behind her. Then the room. I stood on that stage and listened to 350 people decide simultaneously and without coordination that what they were applauding was not a performance or a spectacle, but something simpler and more durable. The truth finally standing on its own 2 feet. Justice. I learned moves at its own speed. Not fast, not dramatic, not the way it looks in the movies where a gavel comes down and everything resolves in a single clean moment. Real justice moves the way a foundation sets slowly, invisibly, and with a permanence that only becomes apparent once the weight of the structure above it has been fully applied. The weeks after the gala passed in depositions filings, and the particular exhaustion of watching a legal process do what legal processes do when the evidence is thorough and the lawyers are prepared. Bob had been preparing for 30 years. The evidence was thorough. Sandra accepted a plea agreement in the 3rd week of November. Conspiracy to commit fraud, criminal solicitation in connection with the accident, financial exploitation. 6 years, minimum security, upstate New York. She sat across the table from her attorney and signed the agreement without looking up, and I was told later by Bob that her hands did not shake, which was the last thing Sandra ever did that surprised me. Derek's agreement came 4 days later. 3 years suspended 500 hours of community service, full cooperation with the ongoing investigation into Carl Pruitt. He had given Bob everything, the LLC, the law firm, the subcontracting agreements, the guardianship filing, and the court had weighed that cooperation against the charges and arrived at a number that reflected the difference between a man who had made terrible choices and a man who had, in the end, chosen differently. I did not attend either proceeding. Bob asked me once if I wanted to be there. I told him I had already seen everything I needed to see, which was true, and that courtrooms were not where I intended to spend my recovery, which was also true. What I wanted was the room. The mediation office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown, with windows that looked west toward the Hudson and south toward Lower Manhattan. And on the Tuesday morning in early December, when I walked in carrying nothing but my own 2 feet and a cane I no longer strictly needed, the city was doing what it always did, which was everything simultaneously without apology. Sandra was already seated when I arrived. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, she was the same woman who had walked into my life 8 years ago, with her practiced warmth and her pearl earrings, but in the way that people look smaller when the architecture of performance has been removed, and what remains is just the person underneath it. She did not attempt the warmth. "Walter," she said. "Sandra." She wrapped both hands around a paper coffee cup and looked at the table. "I've rehearsed this 100 times," she said. "Every version sounds wrong." "Then don't rehearse it," I said. "Just say it." She looked up. Her eyes were tired in the specific way of a person who has not slept well in 2 months and has stopped expecting to. "I got greedy," she said. "I convinced myself I deserved more than I had. And somewhere along the way I stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as an obstacle." She pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry, Walter. I know that's not enough." I looked at her for a long moment. "It's enough," I said, "because I'm not carrying this for you anymore." I reached into my jacket pocket. The wedding ring had been on my bedside table in the house on the corner of my street. since the morning Pat had brought my personal items from the hospital. I had looked at it every morning for 3 weeks and thought about what it represented, which was not Sandra and never had been. It was a promise I had made in good faith to a person who had not been capable of keeping the same promise back. I placed it on the table between us. "I forgive you," I said, "because you no longer exist in my world." I stood. I picked up my cane. I walked to the door. Behind me, Sandra said nothing. The elevator opened immediately, which felt like the city cooperating for once. And I rode it down 14 floors and walked out into a December afternoon in Midtown Manhattan. Cold, bright, the kind of day that made the city look like it had been cleaned overnight and put back precisely where it belonged. Bob was waiting on the sidewalk with his hands in his coat pockets. "How'd it go?" he asked. "It's done," I said. He nodded. He did not ask for details because Bob Whitfield had spent 30 years understanding the difference between what needed to be documented and what needed to be left alone. We walked half a block to a diner on 7th Avenue and ordered coffee, and for 40 minutes we talked about nothing in particular, which was the best conversation I had had in a very long time. The sign went up on a Thursday morning in mid-December. Ray Cross stood on the sidewalk in front of the building on Junction Boulevard, with his arms crossed and his coffee going cold, watching the crew the way he had watched every crew for 28 years. When the last bolt tightened, he looked up at the new lettering and then looked at me. "Reed and Next Generation Electric." "Took you long enough," he said. 28 years, I said. I wanted to be sure. He drank the cold coffee anyway. Ray Cross had never wasted a cup in his life. Diana's fund launched the same week. Small ceremony. Conference room at Queens Medical Center. 40 people, coffee from the break room. Pat stood at the front in the same navy scrubs she had worn the afternoon she pulled a chair beside my bed and said, "I'm listening." She spoke 4 minutes without notes. There was not a dry eye in the room, including mine. I handed her the plaque before she sat down. Patricia Okafor, Compassionate Care Scholarship. "You didn't have to," she said. "That's why I did some," I said. Tommy received the first scholarship that afternoon, walking to the front in a button-down shirt he had clearly ironed himself with the careful dignity of a 17-year-old who understood something significant was happening. Beverly cried. She had brought cookies and was not apologetic about either. That evening, I drove her home to Queens, made coffee, took it to the front porch. Beverly came over 20 minutes later with her own cup and sat in the other chair without being asked, because 22 years across a fence line creates certain understandings. The elevated train ran past. A man walked his dog. The corner bodega had its lights on. Sandra had taken 8 years. She could not touch the 40 before that. And she could not touch what came next. Beverly watched the street. "Good evening," she said to no one in particular. "Yeah," I said. It was. This is my grandpa's story. Not a perfect one. Not a proud one in every chapter. But an honest one. If I could go back, I would have paid closer attention, not to the business, not to the contracts, but to the people sitting across from me at the dinner table. I built walls and panels and neighborhoods for 40 years. I forgot sometimes to build the things that cannot be measured in kilowatts. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for a hospital ceiling to teach you what matters. This is my personal belief, and I'll say it plainly. The people who stay when they think you have nothing left are the only ones worth building a life around. I've seen it proven. I lived it. I believe God puts the right people in the room at the right moment. Patricia was in that room. Beverly was across that fence. Ray was at that door. None of that was coincidence. If this family story reached something in you, a memory, a person, a decision, you've been putting off, leave it in the comments. I read every one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if these grandpa stories mean something to you, subscribe. There are more coming. These grandpa stories, like all family story worth telling, are built from real emotions, though some details are shaped for the lessons they carry. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Find what feeds your spirit. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.